And we have a campus2canton.com extra exclusive. We got some good content for you tonight. We have a guest with us. He's at the Action Network. He's a writer and analyst at the Action Network and at Fantasy Labs. You can find him at Matt F. the Oracle on Twitter, and he just released his 2021 Devy Fantasy Football Rankings. Matthew Freedman. Matthew, thank you for joining us here at campus2canton.com. Why did you start this process of creating your inaugural Devy rankings, and how did you start this process?
Well, one, thanks for having me. As you guys know, I'm a total idiot, ignoramus when it comes to Devy leagues. I know nothing. I got into this rabbit hole because I was interested in doing research on the 2022 draft class because I'm really into mock drafts. I love Dynasty, and so I was wanting to think of what is the Devy market. Think of all of these skill position players who potentially could be in the draft class next year. And so I tried to find some Devy ADP, not super easy to find, especially if you want to look at lots of leagues. And so the next thing was thinking, okay, what do the experts say? I was starting to look at some Devy rankings, and I noticed that there was a lot of disparity in the way that site to site or ranker to ranker people would value players, and a lot of different ways in which people could differ. Some people would focus more on production, some people would focus on recruitment stars, some people would focus, at least this is my interpretation of looking at the data, some people would focus on how many years a guy had left in college. And so I didn't really want to use Devy data all that much in thinking about my mock drafts or the big board I was coming up with for the 2022 class, because there was just a lot of different ways that data could be interpreted. But to kind of go through the process, this got me interested. So I decided, okay, if I, never having played in a Devy league, had to create rankings, how would I do that? Like, what are the things that I would value? And so that was the starting point for this process. And as I said, I love Dynasty. So I have, different models, but different ways of creating rankings for Dynasty. And I used a kind of early version of those models as the foundation for the model that I used to create the Devy rankings. So basically, if you want more information, I can give some. In creating Dynasty rankings, I have three different models. One is before we have workout data, one is after we have workout data, and then one is after the draft. And so I use the earliest version of those models before we have workout data. And even in the early version, I would normally still have an input for projected draft position. But for this, for the Devy rankings, I just left that out because I'm not going to try to predict draft position that far in advance for all of these players. And normally at that point, I also have age, which I would include in the model, but I don't have age data for all of these guys. But, it's still something that I would consider to be like a decent starting point for trying to project what these guys might do in the NFL whenever they get to the NFL. So that really for me was the starting point, a version of a model that I would use in creating Dynasty rankings.
That's awesome. So this question's probably going to be a bit like reductive kind of about what you do. So I'll apologize about that ahead of time here.
Yeah, no worries.
But I know with your background, with Action Network Fantasy Labs, a lot of your work is kind of geared toward, I guess, for lack of, a better term, like gaining an edge, especially as it relates to, betting and those sorts of things, props and otherwise. With how varied you were saying, within the article and what you were just talking about a little bit there about how just varied rankings are from place to place, do you think there is an exploitable edge in the Dynasty or in the Devy world to be found? And is it possible to find it, sifting through this much data?
Yeah. So It's a good question. As someone who's never played in a league, I can only surmise. But I would say, and I'd love your thoughts on this. If people have the opportunity to undervalue the long term and overvalue the short term, they probably will. And I think people do that in all walks of life. And so why wouldn't that be any different here? I think people do it quite a bit in Dynasty, and I could see people doing it all the more in devy. And so my inclination entering into this process was that people in general would be inclined to overvalue, and maybe I'm wrong. People would be inclined to overvalue the guys who would have, projectably just 1 year left in college, and undervalue the guys who are 2 to 3 years away. And so I wanted to underweight in my model the extent of, or the importance rather, of having just 1 year left in college. So I used it more as a tiebreaker, or kind of a glorified tiebreaker, than as a true weight in the model. And that's why, I have Robinson ahead of Hall, at number 1 instead of number 2. And that's not to take anything away from Hall or anything like that. But in general, I'm fine waiting the extra year for the player that I think is superior in any given matchup. And, that's not to say that my model always gets it right, because I did literally I do not know most of the players in this data set. So I wasn't going to go in and try to futz around and be like, okay, now I'm going to go in and actually comb through the data and try to compare and be like, no, you know what? I actually think this player should be ranked ahead of this player, even though the model says it should be reversed. I just put the numbers in, came up with something that I thought might work from a top-down approach, and then just let the model stand.
What you just stated is very much the overvaluing, the nearer to the NFL. It has traditionally been, I think, the devy mindset. I do think that's shifted over the past couple of years, I want to say. But there still are a lot of people and big names, within the devy community that push the closer you are to the NFL, the more valuable you are. So I like that you brought that up, because I am very much a proponent of, swing for the upside a little bit more, even if you have to wait an extra year or two. Felix, are you on that boat as well?
Well, I mean, in our preferred format, Matthew, is Campus to Canton, and that is essentially a deep devy league. And you have 2 teams in the league. You have your college team, and there's a college championship. And once your players, graduate and they funnel to your NFL team. And so our rank, that's why I was like, I got to talk to this guy, because his rankings look like ours. Where you were not valuing, the guys who are closer to the NFL. And so, yeah, so I agree. I mean, Austin, our rankings, we don't really care when people are going to the NFL, because there is a championship and there is a money to be had on the college side of your Campus to Canton league. I'm particularly impressed with your ranking of some of the freshmen, just because those are players who could get overlooked until they're seen on the field. Just for example, Jahmyr Gibbs, who you have in your top 5, I was very high on him last year, got him in the 30th round or whatever it is of a Campus to Canton startup. And just for example, in your rankings, you have JoJo Earl in your top 35. How did you get to the point of ranking a player so highly when, in the case of JoJo Earl, he's still in high school in Texas. He hasn't even But full disclosure, we're high on him too. So I just wanted to hear how you came to those conclusions.
A lot of it has to do with the recruitment stars, which can be very reductive. But if you have a guy who's a 4 or 5 star recruit, who's a top 3 player at his position in his recruitment class, I feel like it kind of doesn't matter all that much when he's going to enter the NFL. You want to have a shot at a guy who's at or near the top of his class whenever it is that you can have a shot at him. You know what I mean? And so even though you have to wait for him, you just wait. You know, like you wait on greatness. You take a chance on getting the best player whenever you can get him. And I think it's honestly a discount. Like I'm looking right now, I have him number 89 overall in my rankings. Like, I mean, honestly, that feels too low. Like for like, and this is me saying this like I know nothing. But if you told me that I could have the guy who's the best player in his class at a position of long-lived value, you know, like if he's a wide receiver and he's going to be a guy who maybe has a strong 10-year career in the NFL, and all I have to do is wait for him for a few years, like, okay, yeah, I can be a patient guy. I think patience tends to be rewarded. So, I mean, I understand why he is at this spot in my rankings. Part of me thinks it's probably too low, but this is where the model put him. And so, you know, like I don't want to overvalue his recruitment status and the potential he has and undervalue, you know, the production and also the recruitment status that the other guys have who are ahead of him. So, you know, this spot makes sense to me, but a guy who's at the top of his class, you know, like you have to value him a lot.
And you know, we have six founders of campus2canton.com. I think we have 8 rankers now. JoJo Earl is in our collectively in our top 20 at the position. And we all come at it from different angles. Like I played a little bit of college football. We have an analytics guy, so we all have different backgrounds to come to a conclusion. Austin, go ahead. You got the next question. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, you know, in the article and speaking here again, you said that you used that model that's like your workout data that includes, I guess, at least from what the article said, recruiting pedigree, mock draft data, college production, and historical draft trends. So how do you balance those different things with the guys that have never played college football versus rising seniors? Like how do you kind of juggle some of that different stuff within that model? Because that sounds very interesting to me.
Yeah. So for I think what you described is what goes into the top 50 big board that I created in trying to kind of project for the NFL draft. What goes into the pre-workout model that I have is production data, of course, recruitment status, and age, or like experience. So if a guy's entering the NFL after 3 years in college, is he a true junior? Is he a redshirt senior? So like those factors. And also, I'll just say I tend to look at production, I think, a little bit differently than a lot of people. Like I look at some of like the core things that everyone looks at, but I'm probably weird in that I overweight some of the things that other people maybe don't care about. So for instance, for running backs, I care a lot about whether a guy's a good receiver or not. So like his receiving production and then any special teams production that he has. With receivers, I care quite a bit if the guy actually has rushing production and then special teams production. With quarterbacks, I care a lot about whether a guy has rushing production. And so like to give a sense of like when I say production, like I look at the normal things that you would look at for a running back or like a wide receiver, like market share, dominator rating, different things like that. But then I also I think part of what differentiates some wide receivers from others in my model is like the degree of ancillary production a guy has. So that's just kind of like a big picture setup. The question you asked specifically had to do with guys who don't have any production weighed against guys who have quite a bit of college production. And the answer for that is I almost ignored production completely when it came down to guys who don't have any production. And there aren't really all that many of them in the model. So Travion Henderson, for instance, JoJo, but there really aren't all that many guys in here who have like zero college production. And so for them, it really was just about recruitment status, and that's it. Honestly, it's basically. But like, I'll just say, I think recruitment status and devy guys, I'm imagining, are ahead of the curve on this. Like, it took me years as a dynasty player to understand the importance of recruitment status. And then it took me even more years to get to the point of building that into a model of being like, hey, wait a minute. That's something I could quantify. Like, I could put in a model. And recruitment status, it's indicative of so much. It indicates, like, it's predictive of how much college production a guy is going to get, the school a guy is going to go to, like the caliber of school he's going to go to. Recruitment status is correlated quite a bit with draft position for the NFL. And then, from there, it is correlated a decent amount with NFL production. So, like, if you know a guy's recruitment status, you actually know, like, quite a bit about him. So even though I didn't have production for, we'll say like Caleb Williams, I still know that he's a 5-star recruit who's going to Oklahoma. Like, I know quite a bit about him just by knowing that. So that honestly, so it seems like cheap to say like I ignored production completely, but like there's just kind of a void there. And the model knows how much a 5-star recruit is worth. And so it still put Caleb Williams number 43 overall because it knows that a 5-star a 5-star quarterback going to Oklahoma is worth more than whatever production a lot of other guys have.
Matthew, would we be stretching you to ask you some player specific questions? I know, you kind of
you can ask
numbers in there.
I mean,
okay.
you can ask. That doesn't mean I'll give a good answer.
Well, I mean, the thing that I'm interested in is where I saw consistency between, listen, I went to public school. I'm not a math guy. But I still saw consistency between some of our rankings. Just for example, Carson Strong is a player that I have been very high on. Mountain West Conference, not a Power 5 guy, but you have him in the top 15 in your devy rankings. How does a player like Carson Strong, who's G5 guy, how does he get that high in your ranks?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so for him, it comes down to I'm sorry, I'm just kind of looking at stuff here. So he's incredibly accurate with the football. He doesn't turn it over. He's unfortunately not that great of a runner, which is why I would say that he's actually like number 14 in these rankings instead of like number 8 or something like that. But it really is the production and then the fact that he is eligible for this next year's draft. And I think that let me kind of go over here to the big board that I created. I'm pretty sure that I have him within my top 50 big board. And like the projection that I have for him for the NFL draft, like it would not surprise me if he goes in the first round. And if not in the first round, like he feels very much like a second rounder, like, top 50, top 60 in terms of where he could go in the draft. And although I didn't include my projected draft range in the model, I think that might be sneaking in a little bit because of the production that he has.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, I would agree with everything you said about Carson Strong. Bijan Robinson. So we at campus2canton.com, we have ranking summits where we essentially argue about our rankings and we, kind of get on each other for how we have players ranked. All of the 6 founders had Bijan Robinson number 1 amongst the running backs, except for one guy had Breece Hall at number 1. Why is Bijan Robinson, who has 1 year of very good production, why is he number 1 over Breece Hall, who has 2 years of very good production?
Yeah, I mean the simple answer would be that Robinson is a 5-star, and Hall is a 4-star. But I mean, I'd also say if you look at the rookie year production, because I don't look at production as like the most recent year production or just total production. Like it is weighted a little bit, and so if you compare what Robinson did in his first year, it's not as if like it's significantly worse than what we saw out of Breece Hall in his first year. It's actually pretty comparable. So even though Hall is a year closer to the NFL, and although he's coming off of a really great sophomore season, like I think they're actually production-wise pretty comparable. And so, I mean, on the basis of what they did as freshmen. And so, given that I think production-wise they're comparable, I would go with Robinson because he has the higher recruitment status. And also, I'll just say one thing: like this isn't weighted in there, but I think it's probably encapsulated in the recruitment status. Like Robinson's the bigger dude. Like, and it's not like that. It's not like that has to matter, but like if you give me the option, I'm often going to take the bigger running back. And so, Robinson at 220-ish pounds versus Breece at 215. I mean, it's comparable. Like they're both on the bigger side of being running backs, but I don't know. Ultimately, it comes down to comparable enough production with Robinson having the edge because of his recruitment status.
So do you weight some positions better than others as well? Just looking at like, if you just look at a snapshot, your top 12 are sitting here in front of me. There are like 3 receivers and the rest are QB running back. Does your model just account for, fantasy purposes, running back and quarterback are kind of king compared to wide receiver? And you had that discussion with Travis May on Twitter today about tight end, about how you should be valuing that as well.
Yeah, honestly, I was worried that I was underweighting wide receivers when I first saw this. And I'd love your feedback on that. Like there's a risk that I am underweighting wide receivers. In Dynasty, I tend to be pretty heavy on wide receivers because they have longer careers and because I think they're also more projectable in that, like, if a wide receiver is actually good, you can see that a little more cleanly in the data, and you can project him a little safer to the NFL. Whereas with a running back, I don't know. I feel like it's harder to know if he's actually good or not. Maybe he just got a ton of carries in college and he's actually not that good. And if a wide receiver, like I feel like wide receivers have a little more of a runway, like because you can have multiple wide receivers on the field at a time in the NFL. Whereas if a running back gets in the NFL and he sucks, like that's kind of it. Like he's not going to be playing many more snaps. So like he's not going to have the opportunity to impress with his route running and the quarterback throws him more targets than you would expect or something like that. So I was worried I was a little bit too low on wide receivers, and maybe I am because just philosophically, I like to be high on receivers because they're longer lived assets. If you hit on a wide receiver, that guy could pay off for a decade. Whereas if you hit on a running back, you maybe have a good 5-year run, but it's probably not going to go much more than that. But as you say, like you really do need running backs in the league. Like it's hard to win a league if you do not have strong running backs. So I'll just say, like, without knowing anything, I feel comfortable with the weight that I have now in terms of this being a little bit heavier on running backs and quarterbacks. But I'd like to know if you guys think I'm too low on wide receivers.
I do know. So I don't know how familiar you are because you're just getting into the devy stuff, like the devy watch. They for years have kind of been like, they were the first ones to do like really deep devy rankings, and they do like a yearly publication with they have like 6 guys over there, I think. But we had one of them on, Kyle Francis, onto our show a couple months ago. He does a lot of work with digging into historical trends as well, and he was saying that wide receivers with lofty recruiting status actually they transition worse to college and then to the NFL than top running backs and top quarterbacks on average.
That's
so I just didn't know if that was data that you had factored in, or if it just kind of turned out that way when you end up putting everything together. I just found that very interesting. I had that in the back of my head as I was looking through, and I was like, okay then.
That's interesting. I was not aware of that. Let me rephrase that. I know that. No, I'll stick with that. Like, I wasn't aware of it like to that degree. Yeah.
I want to ask you a question about a player that is not included on your rank. This is actually a question from our Discord.
Okay.
The question was, and I'm gonna rephrase the question, but the question was, why is Grayson McCall missing from your QB rankings? Grayson McCall is a dual threat quarterback from Coastal Carolina. Kind of popped this season as a redshirt freshman, but I'm assuming that he would not be included on your rankings because I believe Grayson McCall was like a 0-star recruit and kind of came out of nowhere. And so that would essentially just tank his standing in your rankings there.
Yeah. So I amazingly actually do know who he is. But that's just because I was digging into, guys who might go in the 2022 class. And like, honestly, I doubt he will go in the 2022 class just because like, I think he's the kind of player who will need to have like multiple, like 3, maybe even 4 strong years of college production for the NFL to care enough about a guy coming from Coastal Carolina. But technically he's eligible for 2022. So I was at least looking at him. And in my quarterback big board, in terms of like trying to predict the NFL draft, not for Devy, I have him number 18, which would put him at, like undrafted free agent, So like right now I'm viewing him as the kind of guy who does not have an NFL future. And you're right that like out of all of the quarterbacks that I looked at, he does have the lowest recruitment status. I think he was, maybe a 2-star. But he's in terms of like the way that I look at stuff, like he's kind of a non-entity.
Yeah, that's fair. Are there any players that, you put through your model and you're like, ooh, that's someone I need to pay attention to for this 2021 college football season, or that you're excited about that we haven't already spoken of?
Well, a couple of players stood out to me whenever I was doing this. And so one is, and I never know how to say his name, Chris Olave. Is that how his name is pronounced?
I think we say Olave.
Olave. Okay, great.
Different ways. Yeah.
Great. Okay, so Olave, he's number 6 in my wide receiver rankings, which just kind of like gut check felt a little bit low because in my wide receiver big board, which is like kind of trying to predict how the NFL draft will unfold, I think I have him number 2, maybe. I mean, he's, like certainly top 3. And although I don't have any draft capital or projected draft capital included in the model, like I know that he's going to go, I'd say no later than round 2, but he's got a real shot at being a day 1 wide receiver. And so knowing that, having him and knowing that he is just 1 year away, having him as the number 6 wide receiver felt a little bit low. So like he really was the one player that I was thinking about going in and tweaking and adjusting up because just because of like what I think I know about him. But like maybe I'm wrong. Another guy who stood out to me is Arik Gilbert. I'm assuming that's how you say his name. And he's
Eric Gilbert.
Eric Gilbert. Okay. He stood out primarily because there has been a tight end who has really flashed in all of the mock drafts I've looked at, and that's Jalen Weidermeyer. And so for there to be someone ahead of Weidermeyer, like that really caught my eye. And I'm assuming, based on the model, so much of it comes down, and of course, Michael Meyer was also ahead of Weidermeyer. So I'm assuming those two guys being ahead of him, they're both 5-star recruits. It looks like that's probably what it comes down to. But to know that I already basically have Weidermeyer locked in as a first rounder in my early 2022 NFL mocks, and then to know that there are two guys ranked ahead of him in the devy rankings, like that really caught my eye, because it's not every year that we have a first round tight end, especially one who like at this point is already like fairly consensus-y as a first rounder. So Olave caught my eye, and then the two tight ends ranked ahead of Weidermeyer. I'm just sure I'm screwing up names all over the place, but these are the guys who stood out to me.
Yeah, Gilbert is actually the highest rated tight end recruit in the history of 24/7 rankings. So warranted. I mean, and I think that's how we have him ranked. Gilbert. Some folks have dropped Gilbert down to 2 because of his transfer portal thing and whether or not he's going to go back to LSU, but that's the only reason. And he had an excellent season as a freshman. I want to go back to Chris Olave for a second and ask you about your big board. You're into the numbers. Does it matter that Chris Olave is going back to Ohio State for his senior year? Would you have preferred him come out as a junior? Would that have, boosted his stock in your model?
Yeah, I mean, I would have loved, and that's part of what's happening here in the devy rankings, is that he is a returning senior, and so that does hurt him. If he were a junior, I think he'd be higher up the board. But for the sort of like mock draft predictive big board, just in terms of the things that I look at for that, I still think that if he's not the first wide receiver off the board, he will be one of the first 3 wide receivers off the board. And that has more to do with trying to predict what NFL decision makers will do. And although we have a history of seeing guys who weren't early declarants who go in round 1 and end up busting, there's a history of those guys. The NFL still is willing to draft them. And so even though I think it hurts Olave that he will be a senior going into the draft, I think the NFL will still view him based primarily on what he did early in his career. And then anything that he adds on top of that in his senior year, if he can have a, not like Devontae Smith type of season, but something that approaches that, something to where it's just like, wow, this guy really blew it out of the water his senior year. I think the NFL will look at that favorably and draft him in the first round.
It's going to be interesting to see because they're going to have a new quarterback, a new starting quarterback, and a first-time starting quarterback there at Ohio State. And they added Travion Henderson, who's, a dynamic player coming out of the backfield in his own right. So I'm really interested in tracking that story to see if he made the right decision, similar to Travis Etienne and Najee Harris from last year, just deciding to come out in 2021 as opposed to 2020.
Or Devonta Smith, for that matter. I think Olave is hoping for the Devonta Smith treatment, whether he can do it or not. But that they seem similar to me just at first glance.
No, I think they really are similar. They even have like the similar like slight body types, and I think they're similar in that like you look at Garrett Wilson, who's the number 1 wide receiver. And you think of like Jalen Waddle going ahead of Devontae Smith in the draft. Like if Waddle doesn't suffer an injury last year, like Devontae Smith might have a very different senior season. And like, I'm just curious about like which one of these wide receivers at Ohio State like wins out this year. Like does Wilson jump over Olave and like really become the true number one receiver in that offense? He was, I think, pretty impressive as a freshman. He's got the 5-star pedigree. I mean, I could see him like really being the number one guy there at Ohio State, and like Olave actually having something of a senior slump.
Let's stay on Ohio State because you have Julian Fleming in your top 15. He comes out as a freshman, is not very productive, but he was the number one wide receiver in his class. At what point is it? I mean, obviously, if he face plants again in his sophomore year, then he'll probably drop down on your rankings. But did his lack of production as a freshman, how much did that play a factor in his ranking versus his number one status?
Yeah, literally none. You know, like it's just the fact that he was a 5-star. You know, so like one of the guys who did he not play at all, or did he have just almost no production? Like,
no,
which
he
one
played
was it?
just no production.
Yeah. So let me get to him.
They brought
so
in
I
a
can
loaded.
see.
They brought in a loaded
Yeah.
class at Ohio State last year between Mookie Cooper, G. Scott, who switched from wide receiver to tight end, Jackson Smith and Jigba, and Julian Fleming. So
Yeah, his production is a 0. Like it's not that it would have been better in the model if he had redshirted, but like it's basically as if he redshirted the way this breaks down. Yeah, it really is just he was a 5-star recruit who is at Ohio State. Like those two things like mean a lot, you know, playing at like a major college program as a highly recruited guy. Like that will put him very high in the model.
We should not. Our co-host on our podcast is also named Matt. We can't tell Matt that he just said that because he's a big Ohio State fan. He always says the same thing. A 5-star at Ohio State matters. So if you could retract that statement live for us, actually, that would be that'd be
just keep in mind. I do not know what I'm talking about. That is the most important thing that you should take away from this conversation.
We can put that asterisk on it. Perfect. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's all I have, Felix, in case you have anything else. But
yeah, I've got one more. So you did some research on the 2022 class. Your big board is also available at Action Network. I want to ask you about the quarterbacks. You have your top 6 as Spencer Rattler, Sam Howell, Keaton Slovis, Desmond Ridder, Malik Willis, and JT Daniels. Is it too early to ask you what you believe, or how the 2022 class stacks up to the 2021 class?
I think the 2021 class is better. I mean, one, it's easier to say that because it's in the books and we know that 5 guys go in round 1. I like in the mock draft that I did, I had 6 guys going in round 1 for 2022, which I would bet strongly against that. Like ultimately, like the only time that's happened in NFL history is the legendary 1983 class, which had, like 3 Hall of Famers in it. Like this, it's highly unlikely to happen. Plus, I'll just say the top 3 that we had in 2021 were great. I mean, like obviously Trevor Lawrence, like I think he's clearly better than whoever goes at the 101 in the 2022 class. But after him, like Justin Fields, I think should have been the number 2 quarterback in this class. Like he was right up there in recruitment status in the 2018 recruitment class with Trevor Lawrence. Like he was the number 1 dual threat quarterback. Lawrence was the number 1 pocket passing quarterback. What Fields did in college, I think stands up. I think he should have been number 2, even though he wasn't. I still think that he has the potential for a good NFL career. Hopefully he doesn't get derailed by the coaching staff in Chicago. And then you have Trey Lance, who, I mean, as a 21-year-old dual threat quarterback, like that's the dream, like especially for fantasy football, like that is the dream. You do not have many guys like that who come along. And so those 3, even if you don't count Zach Wilson and Mac Jones, just those 3 next to the top 3 right now. And we'll just say it's Rattler, Howell, and Slovis. maybe that ordering will change throughout the season. But I think the top 3 of 2021 compared to right now, the top 3 I'm projecting for 2022, I think all across the board, they are better. And so I think the 2021 class I do prefer, but the 2022 class, at least right now, entering into the season, it looks like it has pretty good depth. So it wouldn't be a surprise if we saw 4 and maybe even 5 guys once again get into round 1. But I don't think the quality of those guys is as strong.
Yeah, I agree with that last statement. I mean, I actually asked the question having my own preconceived notions about the 2022 class. Quite frankly, I would be devastated if my team took any of the guys after number 2. I like Howell, I like Rattler, but if my team took Slovis, Ritter, Willis, or Daniel, maybe I don't know about JT Daniels yet. I would be absolutely devastated. The other guy that I like, who is also in your top 50, is Matt Corral out of Ole Miss, who has the talent and the recruiting pedigree that you like, but he is turnover prone. So we'll have to see if he can correct that. So yeah, I wanted to ask you the question though, because you're looking at the data objectively. So I wanted to see if you had the same conclusion. So
it's nice to assume that I'm objective in all of this. I mean, because there are still assumptions that I have to make when I'm weighting things in the models, so like I try to be as objective and data-based as I can, but like everything has to filter through my brain. And, I'm assuring you, I am far from objective. I try to be whenever I can.
Matthew, I don't have anything else. Do you have questions for us?
Yeah, I mean, I do. Like, you guys are the devy experts here. So the campus to Canton format, that really intrigues me. And you mentioned that so you basically have 2 different leagues, both in competition at the same time. So I could see there being a kind of a push and a pull within your college roster between wanting guys who can produce right away against subpar competition, but who are highly unlikely to be contributors in the NFL. And so I could see there being potentially an exploitable avenue there where if most people in your league are really valuing the 5-star and the 4-star recruits and the guys who are playing at major college programs and the guys who have a real chance of contributing in the NFL, where they leave a lot of super productive but non-promising college players available, where you can have a pretty good chance of year in and year out being competitive in your college league without actually being all that strong in your NFL league, because you're not like graduating guys into your NFL roster. But so I'm just kind of curious about that dynamic in the college league of having guys who have an NFL chance, but who aren't going to be as productive as some of the guys who are playing in the group of 5 conferences.
Yeah, I think you and I just became best friends. Because that has been something that I've been preaching for a couple of years now.
Yeah.
Yes, I think there is, especially because devy is a niche. College fantasy is even more of a niche than devy, and it's really, that is like the third layer that's added onto this that kind of adds complexity, because there wasn't enough already with what we already had going on. But yes, I think there is definitely an exploitable gap on the college side to win almost every single year, because it's money. Money's money. I don't care how I'm winning the money. Cause it's a lot of leagues, they'll do like a slightly smaller pot on that side. They'll say the NFL is the ultimate goal, but still 40% for 60%. I'll take the 40% pot and be happy with that at the end of the day. So yes, that is that is the big debate when you're doing drafts. When do I shift from devy to college? What positions do I target to do that? So that is kind of what we struggle and juggle with every single day.
And there are some players that are a perfect combination of where you can exploit that loophole and get the college production, elite college production, and they still have either a very good chance at the NFL. You could a player like Carson Strong. Carson Strong is going to put up huge numbers at Nevada, but he could also be a day 2 NFL quarterback. You've got Sincere McCormick in your devy rankings. He's another player at I always forget if it's UTSA or it's University of Texas San Antonio. He's another player in that mold. Last year, Jalen Darden, I think, was the number 1 wide receiver in college fantasy, and he ends up going in the 5th round to the Buccaneers. So there are absolutely those loopholes that you can exploit. Just for example, Ronnie Rivers will be out of Fresno State, will be a top 5 running back in college fantasy. You can roster him, but he probably doesn't have that big of an NFL future. So it seems like those players tend to go, some in the mid rounds of a startup or even later, because everyone is gravitating towards Julian Fleming, Damon Demas, JoJo Earl, those caliber of players, because they want to be able to funnel those players from their college side to the NFL side of their leagues.
Yeah, that makes sense. And what you said about sometimes those guys who play at the lower levels still end up making it, like, that is interesting. Like, I think it would be hard to scout those guys, but if you found a way to scout those guys, that could be really intriguing. Like, I'm thinking of someone like Gabriel Davis, who was a 4th rounder, but who now could have a kind of intriguing NFL career. Like, if you could find guys, I don't know, Antonio Gandy Golden, like, if you can find guys who produce in college, but then end up going in the middle rounds in the NFL, like, some of them will eventually hit. And maybe it would be easier to do it at the running back position versus wide receiver. I would be interested if you guys have thoughts on, like, positions where it's easier to kind of dumpster dive or try to, like, free ride on the college side of things, and then have a guy actually hit in the NFL.
I'm gonna be honest. I don't think it's difficult because at every position I'm looking for traits. So at running back, usually I'm looking for size. Like, if you're 215 pounds plus and you're catching the ball and I'm taking a look at you on film and you look decently fast, it's going to pique my interest. The same thing at the wide receiver position, even though I don't care that much about size, but I'm looking for certain things that just kind of stick out to me. And quite frankly, it doesn't really matter what level of football that you're playing at, because I can look at and see at least what you're listed at. I can see if you had any high school testing via ESPN Recruiting or 24/7. So kind of putting all of those factors together, I can say, hey, is this a player, even though he's playing at UAB, Austin Watkins, that's a terrible example because I was really high on him and then he went undrafted. But it's just an example. Like, Austin Watkins was listed as 6'3", 205 pounds his junior year. And he was, in 2019, he was right up there with CeeDee Lamb, Jalen Waddle, as far as yards per catch average. So he was taking the top off the defense. It's a player that I gravitated towards, given his size, his speed that I saw on film, and his production. So you miss, but I think that you can look for those traits at any level of football.
Yeah.
And to be honest, I was going to say, I think that raises a great point that, we as people, everybody, we're not as good about predicting these kinds of things as we think we are, which is why some people gravitate toward, just trying to play the odds with those 5 stars. But if you let people take those and then just kind of take a bunch more bites, the lower hanging apple, so to speak, perhaps, you can still walk away with some guys that obviously, weren't top of their class, but end up, doing something in college and making their way to the NFL. That's often how I kind of look at it.
Like some guys who stand out in this regard, like, think of like Aaron Jones, who is playing at a relatively small school, right, like El Paso, right, like UT El Paso, and now is like the lead back for Aaron Rodgers' offense, just like filthy with touchdowns. I would say, like, any I mean, this probably doesn't matter anymore because the coaching staff is gone, but like any guy who was getting 1,000 yards from scrimmage at Memphis over the past 4 years, hey, like it would have been great having all of those guys because all of them ended up actually, getting into the NFL, and some of them are pretty intriguing, Antonio Gibson, especially. Think of even like Zach Moss. I mean, I know he was playing in the Pac-12, but it's not like Utah is, like a school that people really care about in the Pac-12. Or even like Devin Singletary, like just thinking, I mean, yeah, there are players. Maybe it's a little bit easier to do this at the running back position. I mean, I think there is something intriguing about going after those guys, specifically targeting the players who are at smaller schools, and thinking of like, does this guy, if he has the college production, will he have the traits to get him drafted no later than the 4th round in the NFL? Like, I think that would be a pretty exploitable way of trying to approach this.
And the great thing about it is you don't have to spend a lot of draft capital on those types of players. Just in Austin, if you can think of any players that meet this criteria, I'm thinking of a guy like Ulysses Bentley, who's coming out of SMU. He can catch the ball. He's going to be, he should be an elite producer this season after starting as a redshirt freshman. And so that's an example of a player. I mean, I have him ranked 28 amongst my running backs, but he's a player that I'm keeping an eye on because he's going to help me win on the college side of my campus to Canton leagues. And he has the chance to be a 3rd round draft pick whenever he decides to come out. You mentioned Aaron Jones. I mean, I remember watching Aaron Jones at UTEP, and he had the elite rushing production, but he had plays where they were throwing like deep passes to it. I'm like, how are they're throwing these deep passes to this running back? And lo and behold, he ends up being used like that eventually in Green Bay. So I think that you can find those players. Austin, any players like that you can think of that, maybe G5 or lower Power 5, that you can use on the college side of your campus to Canton leagues, and then they have a chance at the NFL.
I had 2 guys that just jump out in the top of my head. Mountain West is still, NFL guys come from the Mountain West every year. It's not like we're projecting the Sun Belt. George Halani, who's the starting running back at Boise State. And Boise has put running backs in the NFL within the past decade. New coaching staff, but whatever. And then Tyler Algier at BYU. Who was kind of their main back last year. I think those are 2 names that just pop off the top of my head as guys that, and they both have, NFL size. Neither will have the recruiting pedigree. I mean, I'm pretty sure Algier was a 0-star walk-on linebacker that shifted to running back. So they might not pop in that way, but those are just names that pop to the front of my mind.
I'm kind of like going through past drafts. I mean, Andy Isabella didn't hit in the NFL, but I mean, that guy was thick. Like, you really couldn't do any better than that if you played this strategy. Of course, unless you went with Deontay Johnson, who was drafted in the 3rd round, and then now looks like the number 1 receiver for the Steelers. Like, there are significant ways. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, hey, Chase Claypool, like that guy's a grown man. But I mean, yeah, there are ways I would imagine of using this strategy and it paying off big time if you hit. So
Matthew Freedman, we appreciate you so much for coming on to talk to us about your devy rankings. It was an interesting read. You can find Matthew at Matt F. the Oracle on Twitter. Find him at the Action Network and at Fantasy Labs. Matt, anything that you want to get out there before we let you go?
No, I mean, just as you said, you can follow me on Twitter, and I will be. It's interesting. Like, I've never really gone this deep into the upcoming class this early, and so I'm starting to do that now. And I think I'm going to be putting out more pieces that have to do with, kind of like player profiles. Looking at guys in the 2022 draft class, starting with the quarterbacks. quick pieces, just saying, like what I think about them, what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, roughly where I think they will be drafted in the upcoming class. And then, also maybe a little analysis on like whether I'm betting on that guy to win the Heisman or like, am I betting on that guy right now to be the number one pick, stuff like that. So I'll have some pieces like that coming out probably in, within the next few months, just kind of like dabbling that as we start to head towards the 2021 college season.
You got your rankings. We're going to have to get you in a campus to Canton league now. We have to do it. So.
Fellas, I can't take it. I don't know if I should, because I know my personality. Like once I get into something, I really get into it. And I honestly just don't know if I have the time for it. It'll be like I'll lose my job because I won't be doing the work I need to do because I'm too busy digging into, like group of 5 freshman running backs, trying to scout them for like 5 years from now
like
in
Alfred,
the NFL.
Like Alfred.
Yeah, exactly. So there's I don't know. Like I'll consider it, but honestly, for my well-being, I don't know if I should do it.
Matthew Freedman, thank you very much, sir.
Thanks, guys.